The blood came from nowhere, like judgment always does in the New Mexico wilderness. Margaret Holloway pressed her weathered hands against the small chest of the boy who lay dying on her kitchen table, feeling his heartbeat flutter beneath her fingers like a wounded sparrow. She'd lived in this remote outpost for 8 years, long enough to know when death was circling. But this felt different, more urgent. The arrow had been removed, but infection raged through the child's small body, turning his bronze skin ashen. She stood over him, watching his labored breathing as outside, the distinctive sound of hoofbeats approached. In the distance, a group of riders materialized from the twilight, their silhouettes growing larger against the setting sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's hands found the shotgun prop beside the doorframe. She'd seen enough trouble come down that trail. Renegade outlaws, lost settlers half mad with thirst, men running from pasts. They couldn't escape. But something about these riders made her pause. The way they moved, purposeful and disciplined, told her this wasn't some random band of desperados. These were Apache warriors, and they had come for the boy. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He'd appeared at her doorstep, just before sunset, an arrow lodged in his shoulder, blood soaking his buckskin shirt. No words, just those dark eyes filled with pain and something else. Trust. She'd known immediately what he was, who he belonged to, the intricate beadwork on his clothing, the ceremonial fetishes tied into his hair marked him as someone important. Not just any Apache child, but someone of significance. "Hold on, little one," she whispered, preparing another poultice of yarrow. "And Sage, your people are coming." The boy's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with surprising clarity despite the fever. His hand reached for hers, small fingers wrapping around her wrist with surprising strength. "Before we jump ahead in our story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this tale of courage touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you that you won't want to miss." The riders drew closer, and Margaret could now make out their features in the fading light. 20 warriors at least, heavily armed, their faces set in expressions that sent ice through her veins. At their lead rode a man whose bearing alone would have marked him as their chief, even without the distinctive headdress. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a face carved from the same stone as the mesas that dominated the landscape. Eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by threats. Margaret set the shotgun down, but kept it within reach. She stepped onto her porch, squaring her shoulders despite the fear that made her heart hammer against her ribs. The warriors halted, their horses stamping and snorting in the dust. For a long moment, no one spoke. The chief's gaze moved from her face to the cabin behind her, where the boy lay fighting for his life. "The child is inside," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've removed the arrow, but the wound is infected. He needs rest and medicine." The chief's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "He is my son," he said, in perfect, though accented, English. "Eagle who soars." Margaret nodded slowly. "He's very ill. The fever is high. I've done what I can, but—" "You are the medicine woman they speak of at the fort," the chief interrupted. "It wasn't a question. I was a nurse during the war," Margaret answered. "Now I just help where I can." The chief dismounted with fluid grace that belied his imposing size. His warriors remained on horseback, hands near weapons, eyes watchful. "I am Black Mountain," he said, "chief of the Mescalero band." He gestured toward the cabin. "I would see my son." Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to pass. As he entered her small home, she felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her back. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and she knew her life would end as quickly as a candle flame in a windstorm. But the boy inside needed her, and that trumped her fear. Black Mountain stood over his son, his face impassive, but his eyes filled with a father's anguish. He touched the boy's forehead, whispered something in Apache that Margaret couldn't understand. Then he turned to her, studying her face with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. "Your people and mine, we are not friends," he said simply. Margaret moved to the stove, where water boiled for fresh compresses. "My people," she replied, wringing out a cloth, "are whoever needs healing." She placed the hot compress on the boy's wound, watching as pus drained from the angry red flesh. "Your son needs more than I can give him alone. I need your help." For a moment, something like surprise flickered across Black Mountain's stoic features. "My help?" "Yes," Margaret said, meeting his gaze directly. "Do your people have medicine for infection? Herbs I might not know? Between your knowledge and mine, we might save him. Alone, I'm not certain." The chief's mouth tightened, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it. He called out in Apache through the open door. One of the warriors dismounted immediately, a wizened man with a face more lined than the cracked earth after a drought. He entered carrying a leather pouch, adorned with symbols Margaret didn't recognize. "This is Seas Far," Black Mountain said, "our medicine man. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The old man nodded to Margaret without speaking, then moved to the boy's side. He opened his pouch, revealing an assortment of dried herbs, powders, and small fetishes. His gnarled hands moved with surprising delicacy as he examined Eagle Who Saw's wound. Margaret lit the oil lamp as darkness fell completely, flooding her small cabin with warm yellow light. The shadows of the three adults fell across the wooden floor as they worked in an unexpected harmony. Margaret cleaning the wound, Seas Far applying his medicines, Black Mountain supporting his son's head to help him drink the bitter teas they prepared. "How was he shot?" Margaret asked, threading a needle with catgut to close the wound now that it was draining properly. "Comancheros," Black Mountain answered, his voice hard as flint. "They ambushed our hunting party. Eagle Who Soars was with us to learn the ways of men. The Comancheros hoped to take him for ransom." His hand moved unconsciously to a fresh scar on his forearm. "They did not succeed." Margaret began stitching, her trained hands working with precision born from years of practice. "And the others? Your hunting party?" "3 dead, 2 wounded, but they will live." Black Mountain watched her needle pass through his son's flesh with no change in expression. "My son rode hardest, took the arrow deepest." He remembered the stories of a white woman healer who lived alone on the border of our territories. Margaret paused, looking up in surprise. "You knew of me?" A ghost of a smile touched Black Mountain's lips. "We know all who dwell in our lands. The woman who tends wounded soldiers and settlers, who does not turn away Mexicans or even Indians who come seeking help, who left the fort after the Great War between white men." She resumed stitching, uncomfortable with his knowledge. "Of her. And you? How do you speak English so well?" "I was taken to the white man's school as a boy," he said, no emotion coloring his voice, "before I escaped and returned to my people." Seas Far spoke for the first time, his voice like dry leaves rustling. He gestured to the herbs Margaret had hanging from her ceiling beams, yarrow, sage, echinacea. "He says you know the plants that heal," Black Mountain translated. "He asks where you learned." Margaret tied off the last stitch and covered the wound with a paste Seas Far had prepared. "My grandmother was Cherokee," she said quietly. "Before they were marched west, she taught my mother, who taught me. The army doctors taught me the rest." The medicine man's eyes widened slightly. He spoke again to Black Mountain, who nodded. "He says there is Cherokee spirit in your hands. He can see it in how you work." The boy moaned softly, drawing their attention back to the reason they were all there. His skin burned with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. Margaret soaked a cloth in cool water and placed it on his forehead. "We must break the fever," she said, "or all our work is for nothing." For the next several hours, they fought, death together. Margaret prepared willow bark tea while Seasfar chanted softly, burning small bundles of herbs that filled the cabin with fragrant smoke. Black Mountain remained by his son's side, speaking softly in Apache, his strong hand never leaving the boy's smaller one. Outside, the warriors maintained their vigil. Margaret caught glimpses of them through her windows as she moved about the cabin, silent sentinels in the darkness. They had built small fires and positioned themselves in a protective circle around her home. The sight was both comforting and terrifying. Near midnight, the boy's fever broke. His breathing eased, and his skin, though still hot, no longer burned like fire beneath their touch. Margaret checked his pulse, finding it stronger and more regular. "He will live," she said, the exhaustion of the long night suddenly catching up with her. "If infection doesn't return, he will heal." Black Mountain's shoulders lowered slightly, the only visible sign of his relief. "You have saved my son's life," he said simply. "The life of a chief's heir. This debt cannot be measured." Margaret shook her head, sinking into her rocking chair beside the stove. "There is no debt. I did what anyone with my skills would do." "No," Black Mountain said firmly, "not anyone. Many of your people would have let an Apache child die, or worse, finished what the Comancheros began." He studied her face in the lamplight. "Why did you help him? Why do you not fear us as others do?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. The weight of the day pressed down on her, making even simple thoughts difficult to form. "Fear is a luxury," she said finally. "When someone is bleeding in front of you, fear doesn't help them, and helping is all that matters in that moment. Is that why you left the fort? To help?" The question caught her off guard. "I left the fort because, after 4 years of war, I'd seen enough men in uniform to last a lifetime," she answered truthfully. "I came here because no one else would. This land between worlds needed someone who could stitch bodies back together." Black Mountain nodded as if her answer confirmed something he already knew. "And your husband? Family?" "Dead at Gettysburg," she said simply, "along with most of his regiment. I have no children." The chief was silent for a moment. "My wife, Eagle Who Soar's mother, died of the white man's spotted sickness 2 winters ago," he said finally. "Many of our children died. The boy's survival then was a sign of his strength. His survival now is a sign of your power." Seasfar, who had been mixing something in a small clay bowl, approached Margaret. He spoke at length, gesturing to her, and then to Eagle Who Soars. Black Mountain listened intently. "He says you have strong medicine," the chief translated, "not just in your hands, but in your spirit. He says the boy's life was leaving through the torn veil, but you called it back." Black Mountain's dark eyes held hers. "He says you are, like our spirit mothers of old tales, who guard the passage between life and death." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just a nurse who knows some Cherokee remedies." Seasfar pressed the bowl into her hands, indicating she should drink. She hesitated, looking to Black Mountain. "It is an honor," he said, "a sharing of medicine. To refuse would be—" He searched for the word. "Impolite." Margaret took a small sip. The liquid was bitter but not unpleasant, with hints of something like mint beneath the earthier flavors. Warmth spread through her tired body almost immediately. "Rest now," Black Mountain said, taking the bowl from her hands. "We will watch over both you and my son tonight." Exhaustion overwhelmed her, whether from the long night's work or whatever had been in Seasfar's concoction. Margaret's last conscious thought was that she should be terrified, alone in her cabin with Apache warriors, both inside and out. Instead, she felt safer than she had in years. She woke to sunlight streaming through her windows and the smell of coffee brewing on her stove. Eagle Who Soars was awake, sitting up with his father's support, sipping broth from a cup. The boy's eyes were clear, his color much improved. When he saw her watching, he smiled shyly. "He wishes to thank you," Black Mountain said, "for your strong medicine." Margaret moved to the boy's side, checking his wound. The angry redness had subsided dramatically, and when she placed a hand on his forehead, his skin was cool to the touch. "Tell him he is very brave," she said, "and that he must rest to regain his strength." After Black Mountain translated, the boy reached for her hand. He spoke in Apache, his young voice solemn. "He says his spirit saw you while he walked near." "Death," Black Mountain translated, "you shone like fire in the darkness. He knew to follow you back." Margaret squeezed his small hand gently. "I'm glad you followed Eagle Who Soars." Caesar entered from outside, bringing with him the scent of sage and desert air. He spoke rapidly to Black Mountain, gesturing toward the window. The chief's expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in his jaw. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked. "Soldiers," Black Mountain said, "coming from the fort. Perhaps a dozen." Margaret moved to the window. In the distance, she could see dust rising from the trail that led from Fort Sumner. The morning sun glinted off metal, rifle barrels or buttons on blue uniforms. Her heart sank. "They patrol this area every few weeks," she said, "but the timing is poor. If they find us here—" Black Mountain didn't need to finish the thought. Margaret made a quick decision. "Take your son to my root cellar. There's an entrance behind the pantry shelf. You'll be hidden there." Black Mountain shook his head. "We will not cower in a hole while you face danger on our behalf." "It's not cowering, it's surviving," Margaret insisted. "There are women and children in your band who need their chief. Eagle Who Soars needs his father." She met his gaze directly. "Let me handle the soldiers. It's what I do." After a moment of tense silence, Black Mountain gave a sharp nod. He lifted his son carefully, mindful of the wound, and followed Margaret's directions to the hidden cellar entrance. Caesar went with them, carrying his medicine pouch. Outside, the Apache warriors had already begun breaking camp with practiced efficiency, erasing all signs of their presence. By the time the soldiers arrived, only Margaret would be visible, tending her garden as she did every morning. "Stay quiet," she instructed, closing the cellar door and replacing the shelf that concealed it, "no matter what you hear." She had just settled with her gardening tools beside her vegetable patch when the cavalry patrol rode into view. Lieutenant James Foster led them, a young officer she'd treated for dysentery last winter. His face registered surprise, then relief at seeing her. "Mrs. Holloway," he called, dismounting. "Thank God you're safe." Margaret set down her trowel, wiping soil from her hands onto her apron. "Lieutenant Foster, what brings you and your men to my humble home?" "Reports of Apache activity in the area," he said, removing his hat. "A band from Black Mountain's people, we believe. Comancheros came to the fort yesterday, claimed they were attacked unprovoked while hunting." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Comancheros, and you believed them?" Foster had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We have to investigate all reports, ma'am, especially with tensions so high after the Bosque Redondo situation." He glanced around. "Her property. You haven't seen anything unusual? No sign of Apache?" She met his gaze steadily. "Nothing unusual, Lieutenant. Just the usual challenges of living alone out here. Coyotes in my chicken coop. Not enough rain for my beans, too. Much sun for my fair skin." She smiled disarmingly. "But I manage." The lieutenant nodded, but his eyes continued to scan the area. "Mind if my men water their horses at your creek? Been a long ride from the fort." Of course, Margaret said, her heart racing despite her calm exterior. And I've just brewed coffee, if you'd care for some. Much obliged, Foster said, gesturing for his men to see to the horses. As she led him toward the cabin, Margaret's mind worked furiously. The root cellar was well hidden, but not soundproof. If Black Mountain or his son made any noise, if Eagle, whose sores cried out in pain. "You're looking well, Mrs. Holloway," Foster said as they reached her porch. "Fort Surgeon still says you were the best nurse he ever had. Says the Army made a mistake, letting you go after the war." "The Army didn't let me go, Lieutenant," Margaret corrected mildly. "I chose to leave. There's a difference." She paused. At her door. "Actually, would you mind if we took our coffee out here on the porch? It's such a fine morning, and I've been cooped up inside too long already." Foster looked briefly disappointed. He'd clearly been hoping to search her cabin, but military courtesy prevailed. "Of course, Ma'am. Whatever you prefer." Margaret busied herself preparing coffee, grateful that the stove was away from the pantry and its hidden entrance. Through her window, she could see the soldiers leading their horses to the small creek that ran behind her property. Several were looking around with the vigilance of men in potentially hostile territory. "Sugar?" she asked, returning to the porch with 2 steaming cups. "Thank you," Foster said, taking the offered cup. "Mrs. Holloway, I should warn you. This Apache band we're tracking, they're dangerous. Black Mountain has rejected the reservation system. He's been raiding settlements, attacking patrols." Margaret sat in her rocking chair, sipping her coffee. "Has he? Or is that what the Army says to justify hunting him?" She kept her tone conversational, curious rather than confrontational. Foster frowned. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're out here alone. If they found this place—" "I've treated Apache patients before, Lieutenant," she interrupted, "just as I've treated soldiers, settlers, and yes, even Comancheros when they needed it. I don't ask about politics before I stop bleeding." "That's admirable, ma'am, but—" A noise from inside the cabin, just the settling of the stove as the fire died down, but Foster's head turned sharply toward the door. "Raccoons in my rafters again," Margaret said quickly. "They're persistent creatures." Foster nodded, but his expression had grown suspicious. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask, and I need you to understand the seriousness of this question. Have you had any contact with Black Mountain's band? Any at all?" Margaret met his gaze evenly. "Lieutenant, I'm a widow who lives alone on the frontier because I believe everyone deserves care when they're suffering. I don't turn away patients based on the color of their skin or the language they speak." She set her cup down. "But I also don't harbor combatants or insert myself into military matters. Does that answer your question?" For a long moment, Foster studied her face. Then he sighed. "It does, ma'am, and I apologize for the implication." He stood, placing his half-finished coffee on the porch rail. "We should move on, still have ground to cover before nightfall." Margaret remained seated, maintaining her calm demeanor despite the relief flooding through her. "Of course, the territory's safety depends on your vigilance." Foster had just turned to call his men when one of the soldiers shouted from near the creek. "Lieutenant, tracks here, sir. Multiple horses, at least 20 by the look of it. Fresh, too." Margaret's blood ran cold. In their haste to depart, the Apache warriors had missed some of their tracks near the water. Foster's head whipped around, his gaze now hard and accusing. "Mrs. Holloway—" She stood slowly. "Many people water their horses at my creek, Lieutenant. Travelers, traders passing through. I can hardly keep track." "Sergeant Miller," Foster called. "Search the cabin, now!" "Lieutenant, this is my home," Margaret protested, moving to block the door. "You have no right—" "Step aside, ma'am," Foster said, his hand moving to rest on his sidearm. "Don't make this worse than it already is." Sergeant Miller and 2 other soldiers approached, rifles at the ready. Margaret's mind raced. Black Mountain, his son, and Seas Far were hidden in the root cellar, but a thorough search would surely find them. And then what? A wounded child would become a prisoner if he survived at all. Black Mountain would fight to the death rather than be captured. Blood would soak her floor, the very place where she had worked so hard to save a life. "Very well," she said, stepping aside with as much dignity as she could muster. "But I protest this invasion of my privacy." The soldiers entered, boots heavy on her wooden floor. Margaret followed, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain they must hear it. She watched as they moved through her small home, opening cupboards, looking under her bed, checking every corner where a person might hide. Sergeant Miller approached the pantry. Margaret held her breath as he shifted jars of preserved vegetables, bags of flour and sugar. His hand reached for the shelf that concealed the cellar entrance. A commotion outside saved her. Shouts from the soldiers by the creek, the sound of horses whinnying in distress. "Lieutenant!" A soldier burst through the door. "Indians, sir, on the ridge to the east, at least a dozen of them watching us." Foster cursed under his breath. "Miller, Jenkins, with me. Mrs. Holloway, stay inside." The soldiers rushed out, leaving Margaret momentarily alone. She hurried to the pantry, sliding the shelf aside just enough to whisper urgently, "Stay hidden, no matter what happens." Then she moved to her window, peering out cautiously. On the eastern ridge, clearly visible against the morning sky, sat a line of mounted Apache warriors. They made no aggressive moves, simply watched the soldiers below. A diversion, Margaret realized. Black Mountain had left warriors behind, and they were drawing attention away from the cabin. Outside, Lieutenant Foster was organizing his men into a defensive position. "Mrs. Holloway," he called, "lock your door, stay away from the windows." Instead, Margaret stepped onto her porch. "Lieutenant, they're not attacking. Look at them. They're just watching." "It's a trap," Foster insisted. "They're trying to draw us out, away from the cabin." His eyes narrowed. "Or they're waiting for something or someone." As if summoned by his words, more movement caught their attention, from the western ridge this time. Another group of Apache warriors appeared, effectively surrounding the small force of soldiers. "We're outnumbered," Miller said tensely. "Sir, we should fall back to the cabin, use it as a defensive position." Foster's jaw tightened. "No, we'd be trapped." He turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need the truth. Is Black Mountain here?" Before she could answer, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "I am here." Margaret whirled to find Black Mountain standing in her doorway. He had emerged from hiding despite her warnings, his imposing figure filling the entrance to her home. "No," she whispered. But he stepped past her, facing Lieutenant Foster with dignified calm. "I am Black Mountain," he said. "These are my warriors. We have no quarrel with you today, Lieutenant. We seek only to protect what is ours." Foster's hand tightened on his revolver. "You're wanted for raids against white settlements, for attacking army patrols. I have defended my people against those who would take our land, our children, our way of life," Black Mountain replied, "just as you would defend yours." The tension in the air was palpable, a single spark away from explosive violence. Margaret moved to stand between them, her back to Black Mountain, facing the soldiers. "Lieutenant Foster," she said firmly, "there is a wounded child in my home, Black Mountain's son. That is why they are here. Not to raid, not to fight, but because a father brought his injured child to a healer." She straightened her spine. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me first." Foster stared at her in disbelief. "Mrs. Holloway, step aside. That's an order." "I'm not in your army, Lieutenant," she replied, "and I won't stand by while you turn my healing place into a battlefield." A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of wind through the cottonwoods. and the creak of leather as soldiers shifted nervously in their saddles. From both ridges, Apache warriors watched, arrows nocked, rifles ready. "There will be bloodshed here today," Foster said finally. "Is that what you want, Mrs. Holloway? To die for an Apache chief?" "No," she answered steadily. "I want to live for healing. I want all of us to live." She gestured to the armed men on both sides. "Enough blood has soaked this ground. Enough mothers have wept for sons who won't return. Enough children have been orphaned by this conflict." Behind her, Black Mountain spoke. "The woman speaks truth. My son was wounded. She saved his life when many of your people would have let him die. For this, she has earned our respect." He stepped forward to stand beside her. "We do not wish to fight today. We wish only to take our wounded and return to our mountains." Foster's gaze shifted between them, calculation clear in his eyes. He was outnumbered, outpositioned. Even if they won the skirmish, casualties would be high. "And if I let you go?" he asked. "What then?" "Then we remember that today reason prevailed over hatred," Black Mountain answered. "We remember that not all white people seek our destruction." His hand moved to rest lightly on Margaret's shoulder. "We remember the healer who stands between worlds." Lieutenant Foster removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow despite the mild morning temperature. "Mrs. Holloway, you understand what you're doing? Aiding them could be considered treason." "I understand that I'm a healer," she replied, "and that this land has seen enough death." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, then Foster nodded once, sharply. "We ride out, now. But Black Mountain," he looked directly at the chief, "this doesn't end here. The army won't stop hunting you while you refuse the reservation." "And I won't stop defending my people's right to live free," Black Mountain replied. "But today, we both choose a different path." Foster gave orders to his men, who mounted with obvious relief. As they prepared to depart, he turned back to Margaret. "The colonel won't be pleased about this. There will be consequences." "There are always consequences for doing what's right, Lieutenant," she answered. "I've learned to live with them." The soldiers rode out, dust rising behind them as they disappeared down the trail toward Fort Sumner. Only when they were gone did Margaret allow her shoulders to slump, the tension of the confrontation leaving her body in a rush that made her legs tremble. Black Mountain steadied her with a strong hand. "You risked much for my son, for my people." "I did what was necessary," she said simply. From the ridges, the Apache warriors began descending, converging on the cabin. From inside came Seas Far, supporting Eagle Who Soars, who looked pale but alert. The boy smiled when he saw his father safe. "The soldiers will return," Margaret said, watching the warriors gather. "With more men next time." "We will be gone before then," Black Mountain assured her. "But first, there is a matter of honor to address." He turned to face his assembled warriors, speaking in Apache. Margaret couldn't understand his words, but she could feel their weight, their importance. When he finished speaking, the warriors dismounted as one. They approached Margaret and, to her astonishment, knelt before her. Each placed something at her feet, a small token, a carved fetish, a beaded bracelet, an arrowhead, a hawk feather. "What is happening?" she asked, bewildered. Seas Far stepped forward, speaking in his raspy voice as Black Mountain translated. "He says you have done what no other white person has done. You have placed yourself between our people and death, not once, but twice, first for my son, then for all of us." Black Mountain's eyes held a new respect. In the old stories, there were women who could walk between the world of the living and the spirit world. They were called sacred mothers, protectors of the tribe's future. Margaret shook her head. "I'm just a nurse who stands at the threshold between life and death," Black Mountain interrupted, "who chooses healing over hatred, who sees people, not enemies." He gestured to the kneeling warriors. They pledge to protect you as you have protected us. From this day, your home is sacred ground to my people. No Apache will harm you or any who shelter beneath your roof. Or Eagle Who Soars stepped forward, moving carefully with his wound. He held out a necklace, a simple leather cord with a small medicine pouch attached. My son asks that you accept this, Black Mountain said. It contains earth from our sacred mountains, bone from the eagle, and a lock of his hair. It marks you as family. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she bent to allow the boy to place the necklace over her head. The simple gesture felt more significant than any formal ceremony she had ever witnessed. Tomorrow, as the sun rises, Black Mountain continued, 100 warriors will gather on these ridges. They will sing the songs that welcome a sacred mother to the tribe. They will claim you as their own, as you have claimed us by your actions. His voice softened. If you wish it so. Margaret touched the medicine pouch that now rested against her heart. 8 years she had lived in this place between worlds. Never fully accepted by the military at the fort, viewed with suspicion by many settlers, yet never truly alone. She had chosen this life, this path of healing, whoever came to her door. Now, unexpectedly, that choice had led to this moment. I wish it so, she said quietly. As the Apache prepared to depart, gathering their wounded child and their few possessions, Margaret stood on her porch, watching. Black Mountain was the last to leave, mounting his horse with the fluid grace she had noted upon his arrival. We will return at dawn, he said, and Margaret Holloway, the woman who stands between worlds, will become something new. She nodded, unable to find words adequate for the moment. As the band of warriors rode away, their figures growing smaller against the vast New Mexico landscape, Margaret felt something shift within her. The loneliness that had been her constant companion since Gettysburg seemed to recede, replaced by a strange sense of belonging. Inside her cabin, the evidence of the night's work remained, blood-stained cloths, herbs scattered across her table, the lingering scent of Far's healing smoke. But there was something else too, something that hadn't been there before, a feeling that the small home she had built in this contested land was no longer just a dwelling place, but something more significant. A bridge, perhaps, between two worlds that had known only conflict. Margaret touched the medicine pouch again, feeling the contents shift beneath her fingers. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The army's response, the implications of her choice, the new identity being offered to her. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret Holloway felt at peace with her place in the world. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber. Birds called to one another as they settled for the night. The creek gurgled its constant song, and in a small cabin between worlds, a woman who had found her purpose prepared for a dawn that would change everything. Margaret watched the sunrise paint the eastern ridges in hues of amber and gold, her breath misting in the cool morning air. She had slept little, her mind too full of the previous day's events and the promise of what was to come. As first light touched the highest peaks, she saw them, dark silhouettes appearing along the ridgeline, first a few, then dozens, until the entire crest seemed to move with mounted warriors. Just as Black Mountain had promised, they had returned. She had spent the night preparing, though for what exactly, she wasn't certain. She'd washed her hair and donned her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she usually saved for trips into town. She'd cleaned her cabin thoroughly, sweeping away the dried herbs and blood-stained bandages that had littered the floor. Then, she'd baked bread, the simple act of kneading dough bringing a measure of calm to her racing thoughts. Now, as dawn broke fully over the New Mexico wilderness, Margaret Holloway stood on her porch and counted. Not 50 warriors, as Black Mountain had said, but closer to 100, their feathers and weapons catching the morning light. They formed a vast semicircle on the ridges surrounding her small homestead, an audience to whatever ceremony was about to unfold. From their midst, a smaller group descended toward her cabin. Black Mountain led them, resplendent in a full headdress that she hadn't seen the day before. Beside him rode Eagle Who Soars, the boy looking remarkably recovered, despite his wound. Far followed, along with several older warriors, whose faces bore the deep lines of men who had seen many winters. They halted at the edge of her yard, and for a long moment no one moved or spoke. Then from the ridges came the first notes of singing, a single voice, high and clear, joined moments later by another, then another, until 100 voices blended in harmony that made Margaret's skin prickle with goosebumps. The song seemed to come from the land itself, rising with the morning mist, carrying meanings she couldn't understand, but could somehow feel. Black Mountain dismounted and approached her porch. "The song of welcoming," he explained, his voice barely audible above the chorus. "It speaks of the time when our people were given their first sacred mother by the mountain spirits." "I don't understand what this means," Margaret admitted. "What you're offering me." "Understanding will come," he replied. "First, we honor what has already happened." He gestured for her to follow him. Margaret descended her porch steps, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes watching her every movement. Black Mountain led her to the center of her yard, where Far had dismounted and was preparing something on a small blanket spread on the ground. The singing shifted, taking on a more rhythmic quality. Drums appeared among the warriors on the ridge, their steady beat matching the cadence of the chanting voices. Far looked up as Margaret approached. His wizened face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him appear decades younger. He spoke in Apache, gesturing to the items laid out before him. A clay bowl filled with a dark paste, several eagle feathers, a small deerskin pouch, and what appeared to be a ceremonial knife with an intricately carved handle. "He prepares the marks of adoption," Black Mountain translated, "the symbols that will show all Apache that you walk among us as family." Margaret eyed the knife nervously. "Marks?" Black Mountain's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Paint," he clarified, "for your face, and a naming ceremony." He pointed to the small fire Far had built, where sweet-smelling herbs now smoldered. "The smoke will carry your new name to the spirits." The medicine man dipped his fingers into the bowl of dark paste, then looked expectantly at Margaret. She knelt before him, surprising herself with how naturally the gesture came. Far began to apply the mixture to her face in careful patterns, speaking softly as he worked. The paste felt cool against her skin, slightly gritty but not unpleasant. "He says your Cherokee grandmother's spirit guided your hands in healing my son," Black Mountain translated. "He says that blood remembers its origins, even when thinned by generations." Margaret remained still as Far continued his work. "My grandmother would be surprised," she said quietly. "She never spoke of her heritage except in whispers. It wasn't something to be proud of where I was raised." "Yet you kept her knowledge alive," Black Mountain observed. "Used it alongside the white man's medicine." "Knowledge is knowledge," Margaret replied. "Healing is healing. The plants don't care who discovered their properties first." Far nodded approvingly as Black Mountain translated her words. The medicine man completed his work, then held up a small mirror of polished metal for Margaret to see herself. The patterns on her face were simpler than the war paint she had seen on some of the warriors. 3 parallel lines on each cheek, a circle on her forehead, and a series of dots along her jawline. The paste had a reddish-brown hue that contrasted sharply with her fair skin. "The marks of one who stands between worlds," Black Mountain explained, "neither fully Apache nor fully apart from us. The 3 lines represent the paths you walk, the white man's road, the Indian's road, and the healer's road that crosses both." The singing from the ridges intensified. Eagle Who Soars approached, carrying something wrapped in a fine deerskin. He knelt beside Margaret, his young face solemn beneath his own ceremonial paint. He spoke a few words in Apache, his eyes never leaving hers. "My son thanks you for his life," Black Mountain translated. "He says his spirit will always be tethered to yours by the thread you rewove when it was breaking." The boy unwrapped the deerskin package, revealing a beautiful beaded vest. The intricate patterns told stories Margaret couldn't read, but she recognized the craftsmanship. Hundreds of hours of careful work had gone into its creation. This belonged to his mother, Black Mountain said, his voice softening. "Before the spotted sickness took her, he offers it as a gift to his new mother in spirit." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I can't accept something so precious." "To refuse would dishonor her memory and his gesture," Black Mountain replied. "In our way, such gifts cement the bonds between families." Margaret gently took the vest, running her fingers over the detailed beadwork. "Thank you," she said directly to Eagle Who Soars. "I will treasure it always." The boy smiled, reaching out to touch the medicine pouch he had given her the day before, which still hung around her neck. He spoke again in Apache. "He says now you wear his mother's work over your heart, as you wear his gift against your spirit." Black Mountain translated, "The circle is complete." Ceasefire rose, indicating that Margaret should stand as well. The medicine man began to speak in a more formal cadence, raising his arms toward the sky, then sweeping them to encompass the land around them, the warriors on the ridge, and finally, Margaret herself. "He calls upon the mountain spirits to witness," Black Mountain explained. "He asks them to recognize you as Nahimana, she who is between." "Nahimana," Margaret repeated, testing the sound of it on her tongue. "It is your Apache name," Black Mountain said, "to be used among us as Margaret is used among your people." The medicine man retrieved the ceremonial knife, and for a moment Margaret's heart raced, but he merely used it to cut a lock of her hair, which he placed in a small pouch along with herbs from his medicine bundle. This he tied with sinew and handed to her. "Your spirit bundle," Black Mountain said. "It contains pieces of who you were, and herbs to guide who you are becoming. Keep it in your dwelling place." The singing reached a crescendo, the drums beating faster. From the ridge, several warriors raised rifles and fired into the air. The sudden sound made Margaret start, but Black Mountain placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They salute the new sacred mother," he said. "It is done. You are now part of our people." Ceasefire clapped his hands, and the ceremony shifted. Warriors began descending from the ridges, approaching in small groups. They dismounted and formed a line, each waiting to greet Margaret personally. Some brought small gifts, pouches of tobacco, beaded bracelets, carved fetishes. Others simply touched her shoulder or nodded respectfully. A few spoke briefly, with Black Mountain translating their words of gratitude or blessing. Among them came women and children, emerging from behind the warriors where they had been watching. They approached more hesitantly, studying the white woman with the Apache markings on her face. A girl no more than 6 years old broke from her mother's side and ran to Margaret, touching her skirt with curious fingers. She spoke in a high, sweet voice. "She asks if you are really a spirit mother or just a white woman with paint," Black Mountain translated, amusement evident in his tone. Margaret knelt to the child's level. "I'm a healer," she said simply. "Like your medicine man, but with different knowledge. I helped Eagle Who Soars when he was hurt." When Black Mountain translated, the girl's eyes widened. She reached out to touch Margaret's face, her small fingers tracing the painted lines on her cheek. Then she smiled and darted back to her mother. More women approached after that, bringing food, dried meat, corn cakes, wild berries, and laying them on Margaret's porch as offerings. One older woman, her face as lined as a dried apple, took Margaret's hands in hers and spoke at length, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "She lost 2 grandchildren to the spotted sickness," Black Mountain explained. "She says if you had been with our people then, perhaps they would have lived. She asks if you will teach our women your healing ways, as we will teach you ours." "Of course," Margaret said, squeezing the woman's hands. "Knowledge shared saves more lives than knowledge hoarded." The greeting ceremony continued until nearly midday, the sun climbing high overhead as Margaret met what seemed to be every member of Black Mountain's band. Her feet ached from standing, her face felt tight where the ceremonial paint had dried, and her mind swam with names and faces she could not possibly remember all at once. But beneath the fatigue was a strange, growing sense of belonging. Finally, when the last warrior had greeted her, Black Mountain raised his hands. The gathering fell silent. "Nahimana has been welcomed among us," he announced. "Her dwelling is sacred ground to our people. Her hands are the hands of healing. Her heart is the heart of our tribe. Let all Apache remember this day." A shout went up from the assembled people, followed by more singing. This time the songs were lighter, celebratory. Children began to play in Margaret's yard. Women spread blankets and laid out food. Warriors relaxed their vigilant postures. What had begun as a solemn ceremony was transforming into something like a festival. "They will feast here today," Black Mountain told her, "to honor your adoption and to seal it in memory. It is our way." Margaret looked at the impromptu celebration spreading across her property, so different from the tension and fear of the previous day. "I have little to offer so many," she said, thinking of her modest pantry. "They have brought their own food to share," he assured her. "This day you are not the giver, but the receiver." He led her to a place of honor on her own porch, where Seas Far and several tribal elders had gathered. A young woman brought her a wooden bowl filled with a rich stew of venison and wild onions. Another offered a water skin filled with a sweet, slightly fermented drink made from berries. As Margaret ate, she observed the people who had just claimed her as their own. Children raced between cooking fires, laughing and shouting in Apache. Young men showed off their horsemanship, racing. Across the open ground beyond her garden, women worked together, preparing food and telling stories that made them laugh. Warriors kept a watchful eye on the trails leading to her homestead, but their posture was relaxed, their expressions open. These were not the bloodthirsty savages described in newspaper accounts, nor the defeated dependents she had glimpsed at government agencies. These were people, families, living in accordance with traditions that stretched back countless generations before Europeans ever set foot on this continent. "Your thoughts are loud," Black Mountain said, seating himself beside her. "I can almost hear them without words." Margaret smiled. "I'm thinking about stories," she said. "The stories my people tell about yours, and how different they are from what I'm seeing." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over his band. "The white man's stories serve his purpose, to make us less than human, easier to displace, to kill, to forget." He turned to look at her directly. "But you see with different eyes." "I've always tried to," she admitted. "Even during the war, when I treated both Union and Confederate soldiers, I tried to see the man beneath the uniform, the life beneath the wounds." "It is a rare gift," Black Mountain said, "to see truly." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the celebration. Eagle, whose saws had joined a group of boys his age in some kind of game involving sticks and a small hide ball. His movements were slightly favoring his injured side, but otherwise he showed remarkable recovery. "He heals quickly," Margaret observed. "The arrow wound was deep. Apache children learn early that pain is temporary, but weakness can be permanent," Black Mountain replied. "He knows his place as my son carries responsibilities. He cannot afford to be weak." Being injured isn't weakness, Margaret said gently. Even the strongest must heal in their time. Black Mountain considered this. Perhaps that is why the Spirit sent him to you, he said finally, to learn that lesson as I learn it through him. The feasting and celebrations continued throughout the afternoon. Margaret was introduced to foods she had never tasted, shown dances whose meaning she could only guess at, and taught simple Apache phrases that the children found hilarious when she mispronounced them. The paint on her face dried and began to flake, but no one seemed to mind. The symbolism of the markings had served their purpose. The transformation they represented had already begun. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Black Mountain called for attention once more. The people gathered around, their faces now familiar to Margaret in a way that would have seemed impossible just days before. Today we have welcomed Nahimana as Sacred Mother, he said. But even as we celebrate, we must remember the world beyond this place. He turned to Margaret. The soldiers will return. Your choice to stand with us, to accept our ways alongside your own, will not be understood by your people. A murmur ran through the crowd, the reminder of the outside world, of the conflicts that defined the territory, sobered the festive atmosphere. "What would you have me do?" Margaret asked. "What you have always done," Black Mountain replied. "Heal those who come to you, regardless of their origins. Speak truth when lies are easier. Stand in the difficult space between worlds." He gestured to his assembled band. "But now you do not stand alone." From among the warriors, one stepped forward. A man perhaps 30 years old, with a face that spoke of both intelligence and strength. He wore his hair differently than the others, braided in a style Margaret had not seen before. "This is Running Elk," Black Mountain introduced. "Him. He was educated at the white man's school in Santa Fe before he escaped and returned to us. He speaks your language as well as I do and knows your ways." The chief looked between them. "He will stay here, near your dwelling, but not within it, to protect you and to serve as messenger between our people." Margaret frowned. "I don't need a protector," she began, but Black Mountain raised a hand. "You have enemies now that you did not have yesterday," he said firmly. "When the army learns of your adoption, they will see you differently. Some settlers already distrust you for treating Indians. Now you wear our marks, bear our name, and call my son your son in spirit." His expression was grave. "The world has changed for you, Nahimana. Running Elk ensures you are not alone in facing what comes next." She wanted to protest further, but the logic of his words was undeniable. Her actions had consequences, as she had told Lieutenant Foster. Those consequences were only beginning to unfold. "Very well," she conceded, "but he stays in the old trapper's cabin by the creek, not in my home. I value my privacy." Running Elk smiled slightly and nodded his agreement. Black Mountain looked pleased. "He will teach you our language, as you will teach him your healing ways," the chief continued. "Together you will strengthen the bridge between our peoples." As the sun sank lower, the Apache began to prepare for departure. Cooking fires were extinguished, blankets folded, children gathered. Margaret watched with a strange sense of loss, as the people who had claimed her began to disappear back into the landscape from which they had emerged. Black Mountain and Eagle-Whose Soars were among the last to leave. The boy approached Margaret, speaking the few English words he had learned. In their short time together, "Thank you," he said carefully, "Mother Spirit." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes as she embraced him gently, mindful of his healing wound. "Be careful with that shoulder," she instructed. "No hunting for at least another week." When Black Mountain translated, the boy made a face that transcended language barriers, the universal expression of a child being told to restrict their activities. Margaret laughed, and after a moment, So did Black Mountain. "When will I see you again?" she asked as the chief prepared to mount his horse. "The moon will be full in 2 weeks," he replied. "We will bring you to our summer camp then, to meet the rest of our band and to begin learning our healing ways." He glanced at Running Elk, who was already establishing himself in the small cabin by the creek. "Until then, you are not alone." "And the army?" Margaret couldn't help asking. "Lieutenant Foster will report what happened here." Black Mountain's expression hardened slightly. "Yes, and we will be watching for their return." He touched the medicine pouch at her neck. "But you wear our protection now. Any harm that comes to you is harm to all Apache. Remember that in the days ahead." With those words, he mounted his horse and, with a final nod to Margaret, rode away. Eagle Who Soars followed, turning once to wave before they disappeared over the ridge. The last of the warriors melted into the landscape until only Running Elk remained, standing respectfully at the edge of her yard. Margaret returned to her porch, suddenly exhausted. The day's events, the ceremony, the feast, the countless introductions, had drained her more thoroughly than a night of nursing wounded soldiers. She sank into her rocking chair, watching as twilight softened the harsh lines of the New Mexico wilderness. Running Elk approached, carrying a small bundle. "Black Mountain asked me to give you this when the others had gone," he said, his English careful but fluent. "It is for the difficult days that lie ahead." Margaret unwrapped the bundle to find a beautiful knife in an intricately beaded sheath. The blade was of good steel, not the crude implements she had sometimes seen used by native peoples, but a well-crafted weapon that had likely been traded for at significant cost. "I don't understand," she said, turning the knife in her hands. "A sacred mother heals," Running Elk explained, "but she must also be able to protect herself and those under her care." His dark eyes met hers directly. "Black Mountain respects your healing hands, but he knows the world we live in requires more than gentle ways." Margaret slid the knife back into its sheath. "I've never used a weapon against another person." Running Elk's expression was somber. "Let us hope you never need to. But the choice to stand between worlds comes with dangers as well as honors." As he turned to leave her to her thoughts, Margaret called after him. "Running Elk, what does it really mean? This title they've given me. Sacred Mother." He paused, considering his words carefully. "In the old days, before the white man came, sometimes a woman would be born with special gifts, the ability to heal, to see visions, to speak with spirits. Such women became mothers to the entire tribe, guiding them, healing them, standing between them and the unseen dangers of the world." He gestured to the painted symbol still visible on her face. "You were not born Apache, but you were born with the healer's gift, and you chose to use that gift to save the son of our chief, when others would have let him die." His expression softened slightly. "Sacred Mother means you belong to us now, as we belong to you. It means you are no longer alone in this territory." With that, he retreated to the small cabin by the creek, leaving Margaret to absorb his words. The night deepened around her, stars emerging in a sky vast enough to humble the most prideful heart. Somewhere in those stars, Margaret's grandmother had taught her, dwelled the spirits of those who had gone before, watching, guiding, protecting. "Well, grandmother," she whispered to the night sky, "what would you make of this, your granddaughter, with Apache paint on her face and a new name on her spirit?" The only answer was the soft sigh of wind through cottonwood leaves and the distant cry of a hunting owl. But somehow, Margaret thought she knew what her grandmother would say, that paths of healing often led to unexpected destinations, and that courage meant following those paths wherever they led. She touched the medicine pouch at her neck, then the beaded vest she still wore over her blue dress. In a single day, her world had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined when she first came to this frontier. She was still Margaret Holloway, Civil War nurse and solitary healer. But she was also Nahimana, she who is between, sacred mother to an Apache band. The weight of these new identities should have felt crushing. Instead, as she finally rose and entered her cabin, Margaret felt something she had not experienced since before Gettysburg took her husband and her former life. Purpose that extended beyond merely surviving. Connection that transcended the loneliness of her chosen exile. She carefully removed the beaded vest, hanging it beside her bed where she would see it each morning. The paint on her face she left, unwilling to wash away the symbols of her transformation. Just yet, tomorrow would bring its own challenges, explaining Running Elk's presence to curious travelers, anticipating the army's response, beginning to learn a new language and new healing ways. But tonight, as she prepared for sleep in a home that now stood as sacred ground to the people who had adopted her, Margaret Holloway, Nahimana, felt a sense of rightness that defied explanation. She had always stood between worlds, between North and South during the war, between white and Indian in her heritage, between life and death in her calling as a healer. Now that position had been recognized, honored, given name and purpose. Outside, an owl called again, closer. This time, another answered from the direction of the creek where Running Elk had made his camp. The night sounds of the New Mexico wilderness continued their ancient symphony, unchanged by the day's ceremonies, yet somehow more meaningful now that Margaret understood her place within them. She slept deeply that night, dreaming of eagle feathers and ceremonial fires, of painted faces and healing hands reaching across divisions that men had created but the land had never recognized. And when dawn broke over the eastern ridges, Nahimana, she who is between, rose to meet a new day in a world forever changed by a single act of compassion for a wounded child. 3 days after the ceremony that transformed Margaret Holloway into Nahimana, the sacred mother of Black Mountain's Apache band, Lieutenant Foster returned, not with the small patrol he had led before, but with a full company of cavalry, 40 mounted soldiers in crisp blue uniforms, accompanied by an older officer whose silver eagles marked him as a colonel. Margaret saw the dust from their approach, while gathering herbs in her garden. Running Elk materialized beside her, his presence so quiet she still hadn't grown accustomed to it, despite their 3 days of cautious coexistence. "The bluecoats come in strength," he observed, his tone neutral, but his body tense. "Yes," Margaret sighed, wiping soil from her hands onto her apron. "And with a colonel, no less. They're taking this seriously." She glanced at the Apache warrior, who had become her reluctant guardian. "You should disappear for a while." Running Elk shook his head firmly. "Black Mountain ordered me to protect you. And you can protect me better if they don't know you're here," she countered. "I need to speak with them alone, without them feeling threatened or suspicious." When he still looked unconvinced, she added, "I've been handling the army since before you were born. Running Elk, trust me in this." After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "I will watch from the ridge. If they threaten you—" "They won't," Margaret assured him, though she felt less confident than she sounded. "Now go, quickly." Running Elk melted into the landscape with an ease that still amazed her. One moment he stood beside her, the next he was gone, leaving not even bent grass to mark his passing. Margaret took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and walked to her porch to await the cavalry's arrival. They came with the practiced precision of men who had ridden together for years, forming a semicircle around her cabin with their horses facing outward, a defensive posture that spoke volumes about their expectations. The colonel rode forward, with Lieutenant Foster at his side. "Mrs. Holloway," the colonel called, removing his hat. "I'm Colonel James Richardson, commanding officer at Fort Sumner. May I have a word?" "You may have several, Colonel," Margaret replied evenly. "Would you care to dismount and take some coffee? It's a long ride from the fort." Richardson's weathered face betrayed nothing as he swung down from his saddle and approached her porch. Foster followed, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Up close, the colonel was older than Margaret had first thought, perhaps in his 50s, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His moustache was iron grey, as was the hair at his temples. "Lieutenant Foster has made some rather extraordinary claims about your activities, Mrs. Holloway," Richardson said without preamble. "I've come to hear your side of the story directly." Margaret gestured to the chairs on her porch. "Please sit. This may take some time." The colonel settled himself while Foster remained standing, his posture rigid. Margaret went inside briefly to fetch the coffee she'd mentioned, taking the moment alone to gather her thoughts. When she returned with a tray bearing 3 cups, she found Richardson studying her face intently. "You still have traces of paint on your jawline, Mrs. Holloway," he observed quietly. Margaret touched her face self-consciously. She had washed most of the ceremonial paint away, but apparently— "Not all." "Yes," she admitted, seeing no point in denial. "I do. Lieutenant Foster reports that you harbored Black Mountain, a known hostile, in your home, that you treated his wounded son, that you interfered with military operations by preventing his capture." Richardson accepted the coffee she offered, but didn't drink. He further claims that the Apache have conducted some sort of ceremony here, involving you directly. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, cradling her own coffee cup for warmth despite the mild day. "Lieutenant Foster's observations are accurate, if incomplete," she said. "I treated a wounded child who happened to be Black Mountain's son. When the Apache came for the boy, I facilitated a peaceful resolution, rather than a bloodbath on my doorstep." She met Richardson's gaze directly. "As for the ceremony, yes. The Apache honored me for saving the boy's life. They call me a sacred mother now." Foster made a small noise of disbelief, but Richardson silenced him with a glance. "You understand how this appears, Mrs. Holloway, to the army, to the territorial authorities, even to your fellow settlers." "I understand that appearances rarely capture the full truth of any situation, Colonel," she replied. "Just as the stories about bloodthirsty savages fail to capture the truth about people trying to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming pressure to abandon everything they know." Richardson's eyebrow rose slightly. "You sound more like a missionary than a nurse, Mrs. Holloway." "I'm neither," she said simply. "I'm a healer. I treat whoever needs healing, regardless of race or politics. That's all I've ever done since coming to this territory." "Treating the wounded is one thing," Foster interjected. "Participating in pagan ceremonies and accepting a position within a hostile tribe is quite another." Margaret turned her steady gaze to the lieutenant. "Tell me, Lieutenant Foster, if I had treated a wounded Mexican child, then accepted the gratitude of his Catholic family by attending Mass and receiving a saint's medal, would we be having this conversation?" Foster flushed. "That's entirely different." "Is it?" Margaret challenged. "Or is it only different because you understand one culture's expressions of gratitude and not the others?" Colonel Richardson raised a hand, forestalling. "Further argument? Mrs. Holloway, I'm not here to debate theology or cultural relativism. I'm here because your actions have created a complex situation." He finally took a sip of his coffee. "The territorial governor is under pressure from settlers who want all Apache removed to the reservation at Bosque Redondo, Black Mountains. Band is one of the few still holding out. Your association with them complicates matters." Margaret set her cup down carefully. "I didn't choose this role, Colonel. It chose me when a wounded child appeared at my door. Would you have had me turn him away? Let him die because his father refuses to surrender his people's freedom? Of course not," Richardson said, surprising her with his candor. "I would expect any decent person to treat a wounded child, but there's a difference between medical treatment and what Lieutenant Foster describes. Allowing yourself to be painted with tribal markings, accepting gifts, permitting ceremonies on your property that elevate you to some sort of special status among a hostile band. Perhaps I saw an opportunity, Margaret suggested quietly. A chance to build trust where there has been only suspicion and bloodshed. Richardson studied her, his expression unreadable. You believe you can influence Black Mountain? Convince him to bring his people to the reservation peacefully? The question caught Margaret off guard. She hadn't considered her new relationship with the Apache in those terms, as a means to achieve the army's goals. I don't know, she answered honestly. I've only just begun to understand their ways. But I do know that trust must precede any meaningful dialogue. The colonel nodded slowly. A fair assessment. He glanced at Foster, then back to Margaret. Mrs. Holloway, I must be direct. Your situation presents both opportunity and danger, for yourself, for the army, and for the territory. How so? She asked cautiously. If you truly have gained the trust of Black Mountain's band, you could serve as an intermediary, helping to negotiate a peaceful resolution that prevents further bloodshed on both sides. Richardson leaned forward. But if you've merely been manipulated for their purposes, or if you've genuinely gone native, as Foster suggests, then you represent a security risk that I cannot ignore. Margaret bristled at the implication. I've gone nowhere, Colonel. I'm still the same woman who has lived on this frontier for 8 years, treating all who come to my door. The only difference is that now I have a better understanding of people who were previously strangers to me. And a new name, Foster muttered. Nahimana. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. You speak Apache, Lieutenant? Enough to gather. Intelligence, he replied stiffly. Enough to know that name means she who is between, a position of significant influence in their culture. Colonel Richardson watched this exchange with interest. Is this true, Mrs. Holloway? They've given you such a name? Yes, she admitted, though I'm still learning what it fully means. The colonel set his empty cup on the tray. Then let me be plain about what it means from the Army's perspective. You now walk a very narrow path, Mrs. Holloway. As a citizen of the United States, you have certain obligations of loyalty. As a sacred mother to the Apache, you have apparently taken on obligations to them as well. His eyes hardened slightly. These dual loyalties may not always be compatible. I don't see it that way, Margaret countered. Both my country and the Apache ultimately want the same thing, peace and prosperity for their people. The conflict comes from how to achieve those goals, not the goals themselves. A philosopher as well as a healer, Richardson remarked, though not unkindly. But philosophy provides cold comfort to settlers who find their homes burned, or soldiers who must retrieve the bodies of their comrades. Just as it provides little comfort to Apache mothers watching their children die of diseases in the squalor of the reservations, Margaret replied. A tense silence fell between them. Lieutenant Foster shifted uncomfortably, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. Colonel Richardson, however, seemed almost thoughtful. You present a unique situation, Mrs. Holloway, he said finally, one that requires careful consideration. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. For now, you will remain here, continuing your dual role. But you will report to me regularly on Black Mountain's movements, intentions, and activities. Margaret also rose, her expression hardening. I will not spy for you, Colonel. I'm not asking you to spy, Richardson countered smoothly. I'm offering you the opportunity to serve as a bridge between two peoples at war, to prevent bloodshed rather than merely treat its aftermath. Isn't that what a healer ultimately desires? To prevent suffering before it occurs? The question struck at the heart of Margaret's identity, both as a nurse and as the newly named Nahimana. Before she could formulate a response, Foster spoke up. A full moon hung like a silver medallion above the summer camp of Black Mountain's Apache band. 2 weeks had passed since Colonel Richardson's visit to Margaret's cabin, 2 weeks of careful negotiation that had led to this night. She sat beside a ceremonial fire, wrapped in the beaded vest given to her by Eagle Who Soars, watching as dancers moved in hypnotic patterns around the flames. The rhythmic pounding of drums matched her heartbeat, creating a sensation of unity with the celebration unfolding before her. The summer camp was nothing like the military straight rows of tents at Fort Sumner. Here, family groups clustered in natural formations that followed the contours of the land. Wickiups made of brush and hide nestled beneath juniper trees. Cookfires dotted the encampment, their smoke rising to mingle with the vast blanket of stars overhead. Children darted between shelters, their laughter a counterpoint to the ceremonial drumming. Dogs wandered freely, alert but unthreatening. It was a place of life, of community, so different from the desolate reservation Margaret had visited once at the Army's request. There, the Apache had been crowded together without regard for family bands or traditional separations, their movements restricted, their hunting grounds replaced by inadequate government rations. Disease and despair had hung in the air as palpably as the dust. "Your thoughts are far away, Nahimana," Black Mountain said, settling beside her on the blanket that marked her place of honor. "Do our celebration dances not please you?" Margaret smiled, returning to the present moment. "They're beautiful," she assured him. "I was just thinking about the differences between this place and Bosque Redondo." The chief's expression darkened slightly at the mention of the reservation. "A place of death, not life," he said simply. "A prison with invisible walls." "I know," Margaret replied softly. "I've seen it." For 2 weeks she had walked the narrow path Colonel Richardson had described, not as a spy, as he had initially suggested, but as a true intermediary. She had conveyed the Army's terms for peaceful coexistence to Black Mountain, and in turn she had brought Black Mountain's concerns to Richardson. Neither side fully trusted her, yet both recognized her unique position to prevent bloodshed. Tonight's celebration marked a milestone in that delicate dance. Black Mountain had agreed to meet with Richardson in neutral territory, Margaret's cabin, to discuss terms that might allow his band to remain in their traditional lands without constant military pursuit. In exchange, Richardson had promised a temporary halt to patrols in the area and had even released 2 Apache prisoners as a gesture of good faith. Eagle Who Soars appeared through the dancing figures, his wound now fully healed. The boy had grown attached to Margaret during her visits to the camp, following her as she learned Apache healing practices from Seas Far and the tribal women. Now he carried a wooden bowl of ceremonial drink, offering it to her with solemn dignity. "He has prepared this himself," Black Mountain explained as Margaret accepted the bowl. "It is a great honor for a chief's son to serve the sacred mother." Margaret sipped the beverage, a sweet, slightly fermented mixture of berries and herbs that warmed her blood and sharpened her senses. "Thank you, Eagle Who Soars," she said in the Apache phrases Running Elk had been teaching her. Her pronunciation made the boy grin, his solemnity breaking into childish delight at her efforts to speak his language. "Your words become more Apache each day," Black Mountain observed, "just as your hands learn our medicine ways." It was true. Under Seas Far's guidance, Margaret had begun to understand the complex system of Apache healing, not just the herbal remedies which often paralleled her grandmother's Cherokee knowledge, but the spiritual components that accompanied them. The songs that gave power to the plants, the ceremonial approaches that treated illness as a disharmony of spirit rather than merely a physical ailment. In turn, she had taught the Apache women about germ theory, about the importance of clean water and proper wound care. She had demonstrated techniques for setting bones and treating burns that complemented their traditional methods. It was a true exchange, one that honored both traditions rather than elevating one above the other. "Tomorrow will test all we have built," Black Mountain said, his gaze fixed on the dancing figures. "The colonel is a man of honor, but he serves A government that has broken every promise made to my people. Richardson is different, Margaret assured him, though her own confidence was not absolute. He sees the reservation system for what it is, a slow death for your people. He's willing to consider alternatives if you meet him halfway. Black Mountain turned to study her face in the firelight. And you, Nahimana, where do you stand in this? Between worlds, yes, but which world claims your heart? The question caught Margaret off guard. For 2 weeks, she had maintained a careful neutrality, focusing on her role as healer and mediator rather than confronting the deeper implications of her new identity. Now, surrounded by the vitality of the Apache camp, watching children play beneath the same moon that had witnessed centuries of their ancestors' lives in these mountains, she could no longer evade the truth. I stand with life, she said finally, with healing, with children growing strong and free. She gestured to the camp around them. This is life, Black Mountain. What the army offers at Bosque Redondo is mere existence. I cannot support that, regardless of which government claims my allegiance. The chief nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already sensed. Then we are fortunate that you walk between our worlds, Nahimana, for tomorrow we will need your strength as never before. The celebration continued late into the night, but Margaret retired earlier than most, needing rest before the crucial meeting. She slept in a wickiup prepared specially for her visits, a sacred mother's dwelling, the women had explained, positioned between the chief's shelter and the medicine man's, symbolizing her role in the tribe's structure. Morning arrived, with the soft glow of dawn light filtering through the branches of her shelter. Margaret rose, washed in the cool waters of the nearby stream, and dressed in a curious blend of her two worlds, her own practical frontier dress. Beneath the beaded vest of Eagle Who Soar's mother, her hair arranged in a simple braid, adorned with a single eagle feather given to her by Seas Far to mark her status as a healer. Black Mountain awaited her outside, already mounted on his favorite pinto stallion. 10 warriors accompanied him, including Running Elk and 2 tribal elders whose counsel the chief valued. Eagle Who Soars stood holding the reins of a gentle mare the Apache had provided for Margaret's use during her stays with the tribe. "Are you ready, Nahimana?" Black Mountain asked as she mounted. "Today we make history, or we prepare for war. Much depends on how well you have taught the colonel to hear Apache words with an open heart." Margaret settled into her saddle, adjusting the medicine pouch that never left her neck. "Richardson will listen," she said with more confidence than she felt. "But you must also hear his words with patience. Both sides have suffered. Both have legitimate fears." The small party set out for Margaret's cabin, traveling at an easy pace through juniper-studded hills and across dry arroyos that would become raging torrents during the summer rains. Margaret rode beside Black Mountain at the head of the group, a physical manifestation of her position between the worlds they each represented. "What do you hope for from this meeting?" she asked, as they crossed a high ridge that offered views of the vast New Mexico landscape stretching to the horizon. Black Mountain was silent for several moments, his eyes scanning the territory his ancestors had roamed freely for centuries. "I hope for what may not be possible," he said finally. "A way for my people to live according to our traditions, to hunt the game the Creator placed here for us, to gather the plants that heal us, to raise our children to be Apache rather than pale imitations of white men." He looked at her directly. "But I am not a fool, Nahimana. The world changes like water cutting through stone, slowly but unstoppably. What I truly hope for is time. Time for my people to find their own path into this new world, rather than having it forced upon them at gunpoint." Margaret nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. Not a rejection of change itself, but a plea for the dignity of self-determination. It was a distinction she hoped Colonel Richardson would also grasp. They arrived at her cabin to find the colonel already waiting, seated on her porch with remarkable composure for a man surrounded by territory where Apache warriors had killed many of his fellow officers. Only a small honor guard of 4 soldiers accompanied him, a gesture of trust that Margaret noted with approval. "Colonel Richardson," she called as they approached, "may I present Black Mountain, chief of the Free Mescalero Apache?" Richardson stood, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Chief Black Mountain, thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Black Mountain dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to Running Elk. "I come because Nahimana speaks of you. As a man who keeps his word," he replied evenly, "a rare quality among blue coats." A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps acknowledgement, crossed Richardson's weathered face. "And I'm here because Mrs. Holloway speaks of you. As a leader who puts his people's welfare above personal glory, equally rare among chiefs, in my experience." Margaret dismounted and moved to stand between them, physically embodying her role as mediator. "Gentlemen, shall we begin? I've prepared coffee and food inside." The next several hours unfolded in a careful dance of diplomacy unlike anything Margaret had ever witnessed, let alone facilitated. Black Mountain and his elders sat on one side of her simple kitchen table, Richardson and his adjutant on the other. Margaret occupied the head of the table, translating not just words, but cultural concepts when necessary, clarifying misunderstandings before they could escalate into offense. Black Mountain outlined his people's grievances, the broken treaties, the inadequate conditions at Bosque Redondo, the restriction of traditional hunting rights, the taking of children to distant schools where they were punished for speaking. Their language, Richardson, to his credit, listened without interruption. When his turn came, he acknowledged many of the Apache's complaints as legitimate while explaining the realities of westward expansion, the political pressures from Washington, and the limits of his own authority. "I cannot promise you complete freedom of movement," the colonel said bluntly. "Too many settlers have died, too many soldiers have been killed. The territory demands security. And I cannot promise to confine my people to the barren lands the government offers," Black Mountain countered. "Too many Apache have died of disease and starvation at Bosque Redondo. My people demand survival." A tense silence followed. Margaret poured more coffee, buying time while she considered how to bridge what seemed an insurmountable divide. Then an idea formed, not a complete solution, but perhaps a beginning. "What if," she suggested carefully, "we considered a different model altogether? Not the reservation as it exists now, and not complete freedom without boundaries, but something in between?" Both men looked at her with equal parts curiosity and skepticism. "The Navajos have been granted a reservation on their traditional lands," Margaret continued. "Not all of their former territory, but enough to maintain their way of life. What if the Mescalero Apache were offered something similar? A defined territory that includes traditional hunting grounds, sacred sites, and adequate water sources?" Richardson frowned. "The Navajo situation is different. They surrendered completely before negotiating terms. And yet they now live on lands that sustain their traditions," Margaret pointed out. "Couldn't similar terms be offered to Black Mountain's band, not as a reward for surrender, but as an incentive for peace?" Black Mountain leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Nahimana?" Margaret spread her hands. "A compromise, a designated territory where your people can live according to traditional ways, with hunting rights in specific areas. In exchange, you would agree to peaceful coexistence with settlers beyond those boundaries, and would help prevent raids by other bands who might pass through your lands. The territorial governor would never approve such terms without a formal surrender." Richardson objected. Perhaps not today, Margaret conceded, but what if this were presented as a trial, a temporary arrangement to demonstrate that peaceful coexistence is possible? She turned to Black Mountain. Your people would have to respect the boundaries, prove that you can prevent violence against settlers. And the army, Black Mountain asked, his gaze fixed on Richardson. Would they also respect these boundaries? Or would blue coats still ride into our camps at dawn, looking for any excuse to kill? Richardson's jaw tightened, but he answered, with remarkable candor, I can order my men to respect designated boundaries during a trial period. I cannot speak for every soldier in the territory, nor for the volunteers who sometimes take matters into their own hands. Honest words, Black Mountain acknowledged, but not reassuring ones. The negotiation continued through the afternoon, points of agreement emerging slowly like water seeping from desert rock. By sunset, they had outlined a tentative arrangement. A 6-month trial period, during which Black Mountain's band would restrict their movements to a defined area that included their traditional summer and winter grounds. In exchange, the army would not enter this territory without prior notification to Margaret, who would continue her role as intermediary. This is not peace, Richardson cautioned as they prepared to conclude. It is merely a pause in a conflict that has lasted generations, but perhaps with good faith on both sides, it could become something more permanent. Black Mountain nodded, his expression guarded but not hostile. My people have learned to live with uncertainty. 6 moons is time enough to see if the white man's words match his actions. As the two leaders sealed their agreement with a formal handshake, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders, even as a new responsibility settled there. She had successfully bridged the gulf between two worlds, but now she would be accountable for maintaining that bridge, ensuring both sides honored their commitments, mediating inevitable disputes, translating not just language but intention across a cultural divide that had claimed countless lives. After Richardson and his men departed, Black Mountain lingered on Margaret's porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Eagle Who Soars played nearby with running elk, practicing with a small bow the warrior had made for him. You have done what many thought impossible, Nahimana, Black Mountain said quietly. You have created space for hope where there was only the certainty of more bloodshed. Margaret joined him, her own gaze drawn to the brilliant sunset. I merely helped you and Richardson see what was already possible if you could move past fear and distrust. It is not a small thing, the chief insisted. For generations, my people have known the white man only as enemy or as the bringer of false promises. Today, through you, we glimpsed another possibility. He turned to face her directly. This is why the spirits guided my son to your door, not just to save his life, but to save all our lives through what would follow. The profound faith in... His words humbled Margaret. I'm still learning what it means to be Nahimana, she admitted, to stand truly between worlds, belonging fully to neither, yet serving both. Black Mountain smiled slightly. The learning never ends. Even I, who was born to lead my people, I'm still learning what it means to be chief in these changing times. He gestured toward Eagle Who Soars. What matters is that my son and the children who will follow him may now have the chance to find their own path, not one forced upon them by conquest, but one they choose with the wisdom of our ancestors and the knowledge of the new world. As twilight deepened into dusk, the Apache prepared to return to their camp. Black Mountain mounted his horse, then looked down at Margaret with an expression of rare openness. When the moon is full again, we will hold a ceremony to honor what has been achieved today, he said. A ceremony to strengthen the bridge between our peoples that you have become. His voice took on a formal quality. Will Nahimana join her Apache family for this sacred time? Margaret touched the medicine pouch at her neck, feeling the powerful Connection it represented. "I will come," she promised, "as I will come whenever my Apache family has need of me." With a nod of acknowledgement, Black Mountain gathered his warriors and departed, leaving Margaret alone in the growing darkness. But she was not truly alone, she realized. Not anymore. The solitude that had defined her life since Gettysburg had been replaced by connections that transcended the ordinary boundaries of race and culture. She entered her cabin, lighting the oil lamp that cast a warm glow over her simple home. On her table lay the document she and Richardson had drafted, outlining the terms of the trial agreement. Beside it was the leather-bound journal in which she had begun recording the Apache healing knowledge Sees Far was teaching her, preserving it in written form while learning to honor its oral traditions. These physical items represented the bridge she had become, a living connection between worlds that had previously known only conflict. It was an imperfect bridge, built on fragile trust and tentative understanding. But it was a beginning, a first step toward the peaceful coexistence that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she found herself humming one of the healing songs the Apache women had taught her. A melody older than memory, carrying words that spoke of balance restored and harmony reclaimed. The sound filled her small cabin, transforming it from a solitary outpost to a place of connection. Outside, an owl called from a nearby juniper, its voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Margaret smiled, remembering what Sees Far had told her about owls, that they were messengers between worlds, creatures who could see in darkness what others missed in daylight. Perhaps that was part of her role as Nahimana, too, to see possibilities hidden in the shadows of fear and prejudice, to illuminate paths toward understanding that others had overlooked. She slept deeply that night, dreaming of eagles soaring above mountains, of children from different worlds playing together beside clear streams, of healing hands bridging ancient divisions. And when she woke at dawn, Margaret Holloway, Nahimana, she who is between, rose to meet a new day with renewed purpose. The 6-month trial became a year, then 2, then 5. The temporary agreement grew into a more permanent arrangement, one that served as a model for other Apache bands seeking alternatives to the reservation system. It was not perfect. There were violations on both sides, moments when the fragile peace threatened to shatter. But each time, Margaret was there, standing firmly in the space between worlds, reminding both sides of what they stood to lose if they abandoned the path of coexistence. Her cabin expanded into a proper clinic where she trained both Apache and settler women in combined healing traditions. Army doctors came to learn indigenous plant remedies that saved lives when conventional medicines failed. Apache healers incorporated Western surgical techniques and hygiene practices that prevented infection and disease. Eagle Who Soars grew from a wounded child into a strong young man who moved confidently between cultures, spending months with Margaret learning English and mathematics, then returning to his people to participate in traditional hunts and ceremonies. He became living proof that adaptation did not require the abandonment of identity, that one could embrace new knowledge while honoring ancient wisdom. 10 years after she had first opened her door to a dying Apache boy, Margaret stood on the porch of her clinic, watching as a group of riders approached from the east. At their head rode Colonel Richardson, now General Richardson, his uniform more decorated but his face just as weathered. Beside him rode Black Mountain, silver threading his hair, but his bearing still proud and powerful. Together they had come to witness the signing of a territorial agreement that would officially recognize the boundaries of Apache lands, not as a temporary measure, but as a binding covenant between nations. Behind them rode Eagle Who Soars, now 20 years old and serving as his father's translator and diplomat. And beside him, somewhat to Margaret's surprise, rode Lieutenant Foster, now Captain Foster, the young officer whose rigid thinking had once nearly sparked a massacre on her doorstep. Time and experience had softened his perspective, transforming him from an adversary into an ally in the complex work of peace-building. As the unlikely delegation dismounted in her yard, Margaret touched the medicine pouch that still hung around. Her neck, its contents renewed each year in a ceremony that honored her continuing role as sacred mother to the Apache and bridge builder to the white world. Nahimana, Black Mountain greeted her, using her Apache name as he always did. "We come bearing the future in our hands." "Margaret," Richardson said simultaneously, using her English name with equal respect. "History will be made here today." She welcomed them both, this chief and this general, who had found common ground not through conquest, but through the patient work of understanding. As they entered her clinic, now a proper meeting hall as well as a place of healing, Margaret caught Eagle Who Soar's eye. The young man smiled, touching his own medicine pouch in acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 10 years ago, he said in perfect English, "an arrow brought me to your door, dying. Today, I return with the pen that will give life to my people for generations to come." "The circle is complete," Margaret replied in Apache, her fluency now matching his. "Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a surrender, but a new path forward. Not the erasure of difference, but the celebration of diversity within unity. This was the legacy of Nahimana, she who is between. A legacy written not in blood, but in healing, not in conquest, but in connection." As the territorial officials arrived for the signing ceremony, Margaret took her place between the rows of chairs, physically embodying the role she had lived for a decade. The woman who had once been merely Margaret Holloway, Civil War nurse, and solitary healer, now stood as living proof that the greatest wounds, those between peoples and cultures, could heal if tended with wisdom, patience, and unwavering courage. Outside, 100 Apache warriors formed an honor guard alongside a company of cavalry soldiers, former enemies now standing together to witness a moment few had believed possible. And above them all, an eagle circled in the vast New Mexico sky, its freedom a testament to the human capacity to rise above the boundaries of fear and find common ground in the shared desire for dignity, respect, and peace. The healing was not complete. Perhaps it never would be, but it had begun, and that beginning had grown into something remarkable. A bridge built by one woman's courage when she opened her door to a dying child and discovered in that simple act of compassion the power to transform worlds. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.